all of the miracle stories in the Gospels, my favorite is definitely the feeding of the multitude. The feeding of the 5,000. You have to say feeding of the 5,000 because there's two, right? In two of the Gospels, there's a second feeding multitude story where he feeds 4,000. And in one of those stories, it's Jews, and one of those stories is Gentiles. It's very interesting, but I don't want to talk about that today. What I want to talk about is the story we heard, which is Jesus feeding the 5,000. It's my favorite miracle story. Miracle stories are awesome because they're truly miraculous stories. Because you can understand the miracle in a couple of different ways, can't you? Especially the way John tells the story. See, John adds a couple of details that are left out in the other tellings of this story, because four of the Gospels tell this story. And by the way, four of the Gospels that's the only one that's told in four of the Gospels, other than the resurrection, of course. And that depends on whether you consider that that's a miracle of Jesus or a miracle by Jesus. Anyway, it's in all four. Three of those Gospels follow it with the story of Jesus walking on the water. Double miracle. Miraculous, even. Because the stories are miraculous. Traditionally, we tell this story of Jesus feeding the 5,000 as if Jesus took 5 loaves and 2 fishes and managed to feed 5,000 people. That's not entirely accurate either, by the way, because in the days when this was written down, but in the days in which this was written down, 5,000 people would have meant the men. So add in women and children, and it's a big crowd. Even bigger than 5. That's a lot of people, especially to have baskets left over. That's a lot of messy people, especially to have baskets left over. But Jesus does it. He takes the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes, and he feeds everyone, and everyone is happy to have received something. It demonstrates the power of God present in Jesus. A power that is present in the Son of God and not anyone else. It's amazing. It's wondrous. It's a miracle. I'm uncertain as to whether this is an or an and, I have to say. Because I want to say or, but I also believe that Jesus was truly an and person. So this could be an and. There's another way to look at this miracle. Suppose the story went kind of like this. Jesus says, look at this crowd. They look hungry. Let's feed them. And Philip goes, with what? We don't have any money because you told us not to bring money. Remember that story from a couple of weeks ago? Hang on a minute. There's a little kid here. He overheard our conversation, and he says he has 2 loaves and 5 fishes, and he'd be happy to share that. And Jesus turns to the crowd, and he says, hey, who's hungry? This little boy has 2 fish and 5 loaves. I keep getting that wrong. 2 loaves, 5 fishes. He's got some food, and he'd like to share it. In the background, the little boy goes, I was only wanting to share it with you, but okay. And the crowd goes, ha, that's pretty funny. 2 fish and 5 loaves. One guy goes, I would eat more than that for a snack at home. Somebody else goes, I couldn't feed my family breakfast with that. People start laughing, and Jesus goes, hang on. Maybe, but to this little boy, it's everything he has. And he's offering it to you. How many of you would do that? Everyone looks at their feet. Finally, somebody goes, you know what? I've got a couple of granola bars I packed just in case I needed a snack. Somebody else goes, I've got a juice box. Somebody at the back goes, okay, fine, I packed a lunch. I wasn't going to share it with everybody, but now I guess, okay. Before you know it, everyone's got food. It's a miracle. It truly is. Because if you've ever been at an event where there's a crowd and somebody's got food, they're not always ready to share it. It's a miracle. It's a miracle in which Jesus inspires people to share. Actually, the way John tells it, it's not even Jesus that inspires them to share. It's a little boy who's got 5 loaves and 2 fishes. Nonetheless, that's a miracle. And the crowd goes away that day. And some of them are going, that Jesus is an amazing speaker. He's such a powerful speaker. He inspired everyone to share. Isn't that what a great message today, and a powerful learning. And some of the people going away that day went, that Jesus is amazing. That was a miracle that he just did. Clearly the power of God is in him. I wish I could do that, but I can't, because he's the Son of God and I'm not. All of them were really super impressed with Jesus, so they decided to follow him. But then he kind of disappeared. Kind of like those guys in Field of Dreams that disappear into the corn. They didn't know where he went. Then they see the disciples out on the lake in a boat. The lake's a little rough, so they don't follow them right away. The wind's up. It doesn't say it's a storm, by the way. It just says the lake is rough. And they see Jesus walking towards them on the water. And he says, don't be afraid. I'm here. And before you know it, he's in the boat. They're on the other side of the lake. Everyone's fine. It's a miracle. Jesus has the power of God to actually overpower nature. Because who can walk on water? You can't. You're going to sink. You might remember that Peter briefly walks on water in another story before he starts to sink because he's afraid. But here's Jesus walking on the water. He gets to the boat. He gets in the boat, tells them not to be afraid, and they're at the other side of the lake already. It's a miracle. The power of God is present clearly in Jesus because he's the Son of God. That's the point here. And, still not sure whether it's or and. The people want to follow, but they can't because the disciples got in a boat and they don't really see Jesus, but they don't know where he went either. Before long, the disciples are out on the lake and the wind comes up. It gets really stormy. They're afraid. And then they notice Jesus is there. Somehow. How did he get there? I don't know. He had to have walked on the water. Doesn't matter. He got here and he's here. Yay. We're not alone. And Jesus says, you weren't alone anyway. God's with you. You can do it. And before you know it, they're at the other side of the lake. It's a miracle they made it. And the crowd finds them on the other side of the lake. And they realize what happened. And some of them go, that Jesus is amazing. What a miracle. He somehow managed to walk on the water to get to the boat. And then he saved the guys. It's a miracle. Because the power of God is in Jesus. And some of the crowd goes, it's a miracle that they got across. Thank goodness Jesus was there. We didn't really see him, but thank goodness he was there. Because he was able to inspire them and encourage them. And they got across the lake and they were fine and it was all good. And then they spent 2,000 years arguing about which of those miracles it was. Here's the thing. In the middle of those two stories, there's one little verse. John throws in this little verse where it says, Jesus realizes they're thinking about making him king, so he runs away. Why? Wouldn't things go so much simpler if Jesus was the king and the people supported him as a king? Things would have been much easier, at least until the Romans found out, then he'd be dead anyway. But the point is, he'd be in charge. And the people would have somebody to look up to who would do everything for them. So Jesus runs away. After the crowd finds Jesus and the disciples on the other side of the lake, you might remember how this story goes on. Because it goes on with the crowd coming to Jesus and saying, do another one. Those are pretty cool miracles. Do us another one. Make some more bread. And Jesus says, you don't get it, do you? I'm the bread of life. What? That sounds really cool. And he did miracles. Let's worship him. Faceplant done by Jesus. The thing is, we can worship Jesus as the Son of God who has the power of God that we don't have and can do stuff. We can also understand that the true power of Jesus is a power to inspire in us the understanding that God is in us too. That we are capable of being Jesus. Just like Jesus. Not even just like Jesus, but being Jesus. It's an and. It's definitely an and. As long as everything we do in worship of Jesus inspires in us that same belief, that understanding that Jesus was meant to show us God's presence in us. Because otherwise, Jesus could walk in the door this morning and somebody could say, what do you think, Jesus? What do you think of this whole church thing and how we worship you? And Jesus would probably say, well, are you feeding the hungry? Not just spiritually, but physically. Are you feeding the hungry? Are you building houses for the poor as well as for me? Are you taking care of the sick? Are you loving your neighbor just as you love yourself? Are you loving your enemy and making peace in the world? Are you taking care of all of creation around you? Are you doing all of that? Because if being here, if being the church is inspiring that, if worshiping me inspires that in you, great. But if it doesn't, don't worship me. I don't want to be worshiped. Don't worship me, live me. That's the point. The point is that you can feed the hungry in body as well as spirit, as well as mind. You can care for the sick and the broken and the hurting. Not just because you think it's a good idea that somebody else does it, but because you can too. All of the things, I think Jesus would say, all of the things that I showed you, you can do. You might not be successful at it every single time. I wasn't either, Jesus would say. But you can do it. Because God is in you. And in all of creation, God is present always. That's why I keep telling you not to be afraid. I know in the story of Jesus walking across water, we get the don't be afraid. We got it there. But can you imagine in the earlier story of Jesus feeding the 5,000, Philip goes, we don't have enough money, we don't have anything, what are we going to do? What do you think Jesus' first words would have been? Don't be afraid. We can do it. We can do it. if we worship Jesus in a way that puts him up on a pedestal and says we can't do that, I think we've missed the message. The message is that God is in us. That's what brings us back to God. That's what repentance is about, right? Turning away from sin, from evil, from wickedness, whatever you want to call that, and turning to the good which is in your heart, the love which is in your heart, because that's God. Don't worship that. Live it.